Welcome to Let's Talk Security, where we spotlight cybersecurity companies and give an inside look at the people and technology behind the latest advancements in the industry. We discuss a wide range of topics with subject matter experts about today's cybersecurity challenges and how their solutions are helping organizations like yours maintain a continuous security posture. Please welcome the host of Let's Talk Security, Jeff Wolach.
Today on Let's Talk Security, I'll be speaking with the company VIAVI Solutions. I'm here with Ward Cobleigh, Product Line Manager. Thank you for joining me today, Ward.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Ward, I have a list of questions I put together for our chat today, so why don't we just jump right in?
Sounds great.
Tell me about VIAVI Solution and your role as Product Line Manager.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll start with a little history on VIAVI first. You can actually trace our roots all the way back to 1923. You remember 1923, right, Jeff, when you and I were still in high school?
Absolutely.
Some of the folks in our audience probably remember W&G, aka Wandel and Golterman, which back in 1923 was basically just a couple guys selling radios. But that's the beginning of our technology heritage. We'll fast forward a few years. WaveTech, Wandel and Golterman merged with TTC to form a company called Acterna. And then sometime later, the combination of Acterna and JDS Uniphase became known as JDSU. Then we'll fast forward some more. 2014, Network Instruments and the Observer platform was added into the mix. And that really became the foundation for our NPMD, Network Performance Management and Diagnostic Solutions that we provide today. And today, VIAVI is now a $1 billion plus company with over 3,500 employees. Over 1.6 million of our instruments are in use around the world. We've deployed in more than 100,000 data centers and more than 200 service provider networks. So that gives you a little bit of a feel for VIAVI. My role, as you mentioned, is Product Line Manager, and I oversee the Observer platform, which includes Observer Gigastore, Gigaflow, and Apex. And I have the pleasure of working with our customers, partners, and our teams there out in the field to translate new customer requirements into new product features. And I also take great pleasure in being able to talk to folks like yourself about the kinds of problems that we can solve and how we can deliver benefit to our customers.
Wow, that's pretty cool. That goes way back. But you and I go way back as well, or
It's
25
true.
years, kind of to be exact, when we both worked at Network General analyzing communication protocols with the sniffer.
Absolutely.
It's funny because back then we were trying to figure out why devices couldn't talk to each other over a thin coax Ethernet cable, if you remember that. And today we're actually using that same technology to help us find security issues. So can you share with us a little bit about the VIAVI Network Performance Monitoring and Diagnostic Solution, or NPMD, and how it differs from the traditional sniffers that we started out with?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny for you and I, a trip down memory lane these days may require a couple of fuel stops and an overnight stay. I spent so much time carrying that portable Dolch sniffer around with, let's see, we had Ethernet, token ring, and FIDI interfaces. I think one of my arms is still longer than the other. I don't know if you can tell. But how are we different today? Back then, the focus was really on two things: capture the packets, decode the packets. And so, the process was you set the filters, you do your capture, you pray that you captured the right ones in what was, then a very small capture buffer, even at the lower line rates. And then you open that 3-pane display and you face east and you pray again that you can figure out what you're actually looking at when that dreaded decode first appears. What hasn't changed is that the packets are still the ultimate source of truth when it comes to understanding what's happening on the network. What has changed is that requirement to think and talk in hex and to understand those hex decodes in order to get value from the packets. So I would point to three evolutionary steps forward that we've taken over the years beyond just capturing and decoding that raw data. First is the ability to automatically analyze the behavior of the packets and protocols to understand what it's telling us about the end user experience. And beyond that, to even identify when a problem exists, where the problem domain is. Is this a network problem? God forbid, is it an application problem, a server problem, a client problem? And that's really taken performance management to the next level. And along the way to delivering that capability, we've also figured out how to do some pretty cool things with on-demand application dependency mapping and visual troubleshooting, so that we can visualize packet data, not just the raw decodes, but visualize it in new and intuitive ways that don't require you to think in hex or binary. The second thing I would point to is in working with our customers, as much as we'd love for them to have packet capture everywhere, that's just not feasible most of the time. But there is another very readily available data source out there, which is some form of flow, whether it's NetFlow or IPFix or some similar flow technology. If we can combine that with packets, now we wind up with a pretty powerful mix of comprehensive visibility, comprehensive coverage, and we still have that in-depth forensic data as well by bringing those two data sources together. And then the third thing I'd point to, Jeff, is taking that combination of packets and data and using it not just for performance monitoring and analysis, which really kind of is our roots, but using it as part of a strategy for detecting and responding to threats. We used to spend most of our time talking to network engineers and network operations folks, but now we're finding that the types of information that we can provide is being used collaboratively by both the network and the security side of the house. So, I'd kind of highlight those three things as the big leaps forward that we've taken when it comes to, us versus the old sniffer back in the day.
Yeah, you forgot to mention when you're looking at that 3-pane decode that you had to put your propeller hat on.
It's true. It's true. I went to a month of Sniffer University classes, and I had the propeller spinning pretty fast by the time I left.
Absolutely. Hey, you recently did a presentation for the SANS Institute on cybersecurity. Your presentation was titled, Act Like You've Been Hacked. That's an interesting title. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by act like you've been hacked?
Sure, it does require a bit of an explanation. When folks hear act like you've been hacked, they may immediately think of something like breach attack simulation. But what I'm actually referring to here is more of a mindset and a mental exercise wherein on an ongoing basis, we carefully think through, we plan, we document how we'll respond when, not if, a breach occurs. And while that may sound okay, that's kind of basic and obvious, what I'll highlight is again, this isn't a one-time deal. It's an ongoing mindset. And the reason for that is, as we all know, our world is ever changing. So we think about the corporate informational crown jewels, the informational resources that we're most concerned with keeping safe. Now, they may move. Perhaps they started out in an on-premises data center, and now some pieces of that information have moved to cloud, for instance. Even if those critical informational resources have more or less stayed put, the way that we get to that information may change, especially in the last 8 months or so. But every time a piece of this equation or architecture changes, we potentially open up new ways for the bad guys to access those resources and that data that we're most concerned with protecting. So this mindset of acting like you've been hacked causes us to continuously think through, how will I respond when those resources are compromised? And do I have the visibility that I need in place right now to quickly and efficiently react to a breach? Understand it, confidently take the steps needed to remediate, including documenting exactly what happened, how it happened, and what information was compromised.
So don't run around and saying, I've been hacked.
You can do that.
Screaming.
I mean, if it helps, that might bring the blood pressure down or up. I'm not sure, but no, that's not really the crux of the idea.
You also talk about the volume of attacks being on the rise and new type of exploits appearing at an unprecedented rate these days. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, and actually, I'm gonna pull up a few statistics here that I wanted to share with you and your audience. I did some research. It's been a few months ago now, but it was after companies had gained enough data to begin to reliably assess and understand the impact of COVID-19. Cloudflare stated at the time that online threats had risen to 6 times their usual levels. And around the same time, Barracuda Networks published a similar number. Now, they were focused on phishing attempts, but they said that phishing attempts had increased by over 600%. So big increase in the number of attempts. How did that translate into success? One data point I found was the IOMART research stated that in the first quarter of 2020, the number of breaches increased by 273% compared to Q1 of 2019. VMware reported that ransomware is up 90%. Destructive attacks are up 102%. So lots of data points from a number of different vendors looking at the industry in different ways, all point to big trends heading up. Now, as far as new types of exploits, the FBI has a group called the Internet Cyber Complaint Center, ICC, and they've seen and reported a big increase in complaints. The latest numbers I saw were 12,400 reported scams that were just COVID related, right? So 12,400 COVID scams.
Wow.
And then Interpol had some pretty interesting numbers here I just found too. And I'm going to quote directly from this report that I saw from them. In one 4-month period, 907,000 spam messages, 737 incidents related to malware, and 48,000 malicious URLs, all related to COVID-19, were detected by one of Interpol's private sector partners. So those are staggering numbers. And then, again, what's new? You may remember back in the March, April timeframe, Jeff, when we were, we'd all headed home and everybody was downloading Zoom. There were a number of reports that detailed new attacks built on bogus Zoom installers. So as they always do, the cyber criminals were exploiting the popular trends and new user behaviors. Oh, everyone's downloading Zoom. Let's stick some malware in the installer. There were multiple times that was seen. So now let's play it forward a little bit. Here's an interesting quote from an Interpol report that was published in August. And again, I'm going to quote them verbatim here. It says, when a COVID-19 vaccination is available, it is highly probable that there will be another spike in phishing related to these medical products, as well as network intrusion and cyber attacks to steal data. So every significant change that we see on the world scene seems to open multiple new doors of opportunity for the criminals to slide through.
Yeah, that's pretty sad. I mean, how
isn't it?
These criminals are just taking advantage of the situation that impacts.
I think there was a moment in time where we hoped like back at the end of February, beginning of March, that this would be the moment for the bad guys to show that they had a conscience, to show that they had a soul that wasn't just jet black. And that glimmer of hope was just, it was gone in a heartbeat.
Yeah, no, I mean, you also referred in your presentation at SANS about the insider instances being a growing problem. And, seeing that we're actually now shifted a little bit, working from home remotely, what would you say about insider threats? I mean, are they still an issue?
Yeah, they're a different issue to some degree. I'll explain what I mean by that. I found some research from, this was I think it was a Ponemon Institute report that IBM was sponsoring, and it talked specifically about insider threats. And here's a few eye-opening numbers. It said that the frequency of insider incidents per company, so everyone involved in this study, it tripled between 2016 and 2020. And at the same time, the number of incidents was tripling. The associated cost per incident increased by 77%. Well, how much is that cost? Incidents that took more than 90 days to contain cost organizations right around $13.8 million on an annualized basis, so nearly $14 million. Incidents that lasted less than 30 days cost about half that, $7.1 million. But on average, it took 77 days to contain an insider threat. So that leaves most companies looking at that higher number. Now, you hit on an interesting dimension here, which is work from home. How does that affect this? Well, here's the thing to consider. An insider threat, by definition, can be either a criminal, a malicious insider, or it can just be a negligent employee or contractor who just doesn't know better. Both qualify as an insider threat. So let's connect the dots here for a second and reflect back on what we just talked about a moment ago. We have employees at home working on devices and networks that are likely nowhere near as secure as what they used in the workplace. We have a bunch of new attacks that are specifically targeting our users' biggest fears and concerns. We have bad guys out there who are always, crafting new attacks, in this case, specifically looking for users who are leveraging corporate VPNs and designing attacks on that specific profile, remote user logging in and off of a corporate VPN, new attacks that are focused just on that. We have phishing attacks that are more sophisticated than ever. So add all this up, and what you wind up with isn't a big spike in malicious insider threats. It's a big spike in accidental insider threats. Our users aren't malicious. They're just falling victim to a really smart and determined adversary who knows how to target all the weaknesses that have been created by this changing environment.
I mean, the number of phishing emails that, we're seeing and how legitimate they look. I just tell people, don't click on anything. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah,
you just can't trust them.
You used to be able to look at it, and if you gave it a moment's consideration, you'd find the problem, right? The logo at the bottom was blurry. You'd find the grammar errors. You'd find all the obvious things. You'd hover over the URL and it would be, some really sketchy looking address. But now the craftsmanship that's going into these new phishing emails, you have to really sit there and study those things in some cases to figure out what's legit and what's not. So, and our users, some of them are very conscientious about this, but let's face it, they get busy, they get fooled. They see a subject line that's, what was the one here just recently? It had something to do with COVID occurrences in a particular area, and people that were in that geographic area, they just clicked. They didn't stop and study the number of pixels in the logo or the URL. They wanted to know what was going on, and so these new attempts are very clever, very focused.
Yeah, no, and again, you and I have a trained eye for it, but at the same time, I got fooled a couple of times. I was getting ready to click, and then I said, wait. Let me take a look at this again. And man, it was crazy.
Yeah.
But you also talked about the cost of a breach and the time it takes to identify and contain a breach. Can you take us through how organizations can save money by detecting and containing breaches earlier?
Sure. And I'm going to rely on some third-party research and we'll do the math on it. Again, Ponemon is a good source of information. They released just recently here their 15th annual cost of a data breach report. And this report, she weighs in at a hefty 82 pages, but I'll extract just a few numbers that are relevant to this question. What they found is that the average cost of a data breach was $3.86 million. That's pretty consistent with what was reported in the 2019 report, which was $3.92 million. It sounds like it actually went down a little bit, right? But hang on, more on that in a moment. The average time to identify and contain a breach, 280 days. Last year's report, 279 days. Okay, well, if you just look at those numbers, it almost looks like maybe we've plateaued or maybe we're at least kind of holding steady year over year. But unfortunately, we have to factor in an additional angle on this. Most of the breach incidents that were studied in this report actually occurred prior to the pandemic. So some supplemental research questions were needed to ask about the impact of a remote workforce. 70% of those who responded said that the remote workforce increase would translate into an increase in the cost of a data breach. And 76% said it would increase the amount of time required to contain a potential data breach. So having this remote workforce in the equation now actually caused an increase in the total cost of the data breach of nearly $137,000. So now our adjusted cost is $4 million. But what about for large enterprises, for companies that had over 25,000 employees, the cost of a data breach averaged $5.5 million. But as scary as those numbers are, I want to go back to that 280-day number for a minute. And that 280-day number, again, we factor in the supplemental information. It's 280 plus. We don't know how much, but it's more than 280 on average. What if we could reduce that number by even 10%? I mean, that's a month. What would that translate in terms of cost savings? Likely hundreds of thousands of dollars. And those are really good numbers to think about and to leverage if you're trying to justify an investment in the kinds of tools and technologies that can help you bring that breach life cycle and that cost down.
Right. And you mentioned also that current defenses aren't keeping up. What did you kind of mean by that?
Yeah, and I don't want to offend anyone here, but I think it's a defensible statement. The base of that statement is partly it hinges on the release of some studies and analysis on security effectiveness. And I'm going to use a data point here, a 2020 Mandiant security effectiveness report found that on average, 53% of attacks went undetected by the tools who are supposed to find them. And what's really frustrating is that one of the biggest issues that people are dealing with is the volume of false positives. But this study found that for actual attacks, alerts were only generated 9% of the time. So alerts are getting generated in volume, but apparently not the stuff that matters. The other basis for my claim and my statement that defenses aren't keeping up is just the numbers themselves, right? Think about what we just talked about, 280 plus days of dwell time. That kind of speaks for itself. What we're doing isn't working, or at least it's not working well enough in most environments.
And, we have the data sources. I mean, you spoke about that. Talk to me a little bit about what you mean by data sources. What data sources are you referring to?
Sure. And obviously there's plenty of data sources out there on our networks these days. But for VIAVI, the primary data sources that we focus on are packets and variations of flow data. Now, we can also use log data. We tactically use SNMP to gather device information. But when I say, we already have the data sources, what I'm really referring to is packets and flow. Everyone has some ability to capture packets and collect flow records. The key is leveraging those data sources more fully. Unfortunately, what we see in so many cases is that flow is utilized as only the most basic form of telemetry. It's just this rudimentary form of volumetric analysis. I see this many conversations using this many protocols producing this many bytes of data. And that's, initially what flow was built for. But today, flow can offer so much more. I want to, when I add some third-party credibility to this, there was an interesting report published on September 1st, and this was a joint cybersecurity advisory that combines guidance from the leading security authorities in 5 different countries. I think this document was kind of a first of its kind. It was entitled the Technical Approaches to Uncovering and Remediating Malicious Activity. In the document summary, page 1, the first key takeaway was collect relevant artifacts, logs, and data for further analysis. Okay, no real surprise there. Collecting data sounds like a good idea. But which data sources were they mentioning or talking about? Both packet data and, wait for it, NetFlow were specifically mentioned. And a little deeper into the report, the specific recommendation sounded like this. It said, employ NetFlow capture, set a minimum retention period of 180 days, capture NetFlow on all ingress and egress ports of network segments. So according to the top experts in 5 countries who are establishing and agreeing upon best practices, flow data is actually more useful and relevant than ever. It is, in fact, a great way to detect anomalous behaviors. And packet data, it shouldn't be viewed as the data of last resort. As we touched on here when we first started talking, many people still equate packets with this combination of sorcery and time-consuming manual analysis. But packet data is really ideally suited for forensic analysis of threat events. You can't take the packets off the wire. Those packets tell you exactly what happened and how much damage was done. So these data sources are out there. We don't need to create more data. We don't need to create new types of data. We just have to analyze and present the existing data in ways where this type of information can be more clearly understood by a broader audience and applied more efficiently to more use cases.
And people don't understand. I mean, they think NetFlow, packet capture, that's all network data, but that network data, as you mentioned, has all the information that you need to really detect the security breach, or at least identify the characteristics of a security breach. I love some of your, vernacular in your presentation, and one of them is repositioning the cameras. Talk to me about that.
Sure. So repositioning the cameras, I'll try to illustrate what I mean by that. Suppose you own a large retail store and you position the security cameras at the entrances, at the point of sale locations, near your high value items, and some other key locations. So you have the cameras where you need it. They give you all the visibility that you want, but then, you close the store. And so while you probably want to keep an eye on the store to some degree, at least monitor the entrances and exits, you're likely to shift your primary focus to what's happening with your online presence and those that are visiting your store remotely. You need visibility into new areas. So let me make sure that the illustration, the application are clear. We'll use NetFlow as the example. Once upon a time, way back in January, you may have been using flow data to look at ingress traffic on the WAN interfaces on your edge routers. Those flow emitting devices were your cameras, so to speak. They helped you understand who was walking into your store, if you will, the remote locations that you're monitoring. But now, what if with work from home, many of those remote locations are just sitting empty? Is this still where you want to focus? This is where I'll go back to the act like you've been hacked mindset. We want to think through, where are the information sources that we're most concerned with? Data center, cloud. How can those resources be accessed? What's the path that a hacker would need to take to access them? And then finally, which of our cameras, meaning our infrastructure devices, can give you the clearest views? Now, there's many devices that can potentially give us flow or log information. It's a long list of both physical and virtual devices: firewalls, load balancers, packet brokers, VPN concentrators, SD-WAN edge devices, wireless LAN controllers, proxy servers. The cloud has a whole other set, VPC flow logs. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting you turn on all those cameras. I'm not suggesting you try to collect data from each and every one of them. But what I would recommend is a careful assessment of which one of those data sources can provide you with the best view, the best information when a breach does occur. So lots of words. I guess the short answer, Jeff, is make sure where you're collecting data today is well aligned with where the most important data is flowing today.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense. You've been talking a lot about flow data. We know that flow data, has usually in the past come from, like you say, firewalls, routers. But there's also something called enriched flow data. And that, I think, is where VIAVI kind of sets themselves apart with leveraging that data. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of my favorite subjects. Thank you. As you well know, NetFlow has evolved tremendously over the years, especially since the long-awaited IPFix standard finally emerged. And with that evolution came new potential uses for flow data. Many devices can give you so much more than what NetFlow version 5 gave you back in the day, more than just the IP addresses, the ports, the protocols, the type of service. These devices can now tell you via flow what they're doing with data. For instance, a firewall might include event data in a flow record, or a packet broker might perform DPI-like inspection of the packets that it's forwarding and report on the applications and URLs that are being accessed, and that winds up in a flow record. Well, we wanted to see if we could take that even a step further. We wanted to take flow records and add even more goodness. So, for instance, we can leverage Active Directory integration to understand the association between user IDs and the IP addresses that those users are associated with, right? So instead of just giving you source and destination IP, let me also tell you who the user was of that address or those addresses. Or if multiple users shared an address, let me tell you who they were. And we're going to put that information in the flow record. And then, as I alluded to before, we use SNMP tactically to gather information from flow-enabled devices. So, for instance, ARP and CAM tables now can provide us with MAC addresses. They can provide us with port and VLAN details, and we can add that into the flow records. We can even take syslog data and convert it into a flow format, sort of make it fit into a flow template. Our SEs out in the field have been working with customers, leveraging a very cool variety of data sources, things like F5 load balancers, which, by the way, it's pretty neat when you can see, when you can use flow to see the addresses and ports on both sides of a device that changes that information. We're seeing people wanting to use AWS CloudWatch, Azure Network Watcher to get session information. Palo Alto firewalls to get NAT mappings, application IDs, user IDs. We see customers now wanting to use Zscaler firewalls, web proxies, and cloud VPN technologies. That's another data source. So enriched flow allows us to fully leverage what these devices natively share and then augment it even further with other sources of information. And honestly, Jeff, when we sit down and talk to our customers about it, we're finding new use cases all the time.
No, that's very cool. Hey, Ward, your marketing people sent over a video clip that you put together that shows a little bit about what you're talking about. Would you want to set that up for us before we show everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it sort of combines or hopefully illustrates several of the things we've talked about so far, Jeff. One of the things we'll see is this idea of profiles. And I don't think we touched on that too much, but the idea behind a profile is if you can define what's normal for a device, for a group of devices, or for a service, then we can help you see when things aren't normal. So, for instance, when an ATM starts doing something that an ATM shouldn't do, we can tell you about that. And so this is of obvious use when you're talking about, IoT, when you're talking about patient monitors, when you're talking about point of sale systems, things that should behave in very predictable manners at all times. Having a profile allows you to see when something unexpected is occurring. That same idea, that same capability can be applied to a service. So take something like DNS. We might define a profile for DNS requests within our corporate organization, where those requests should go, where they should be, where they should receive responses. And if we see something that doesn't fit that profile, again, tell me about it. So that's one of the things we'll see in the demo. But then we want to, and we're, by the way, Flow is what's providing that capability. But we wanted to also show kind of the power of the packets. And so you'll see demonstrated some suspicious activity, Flow finds it, and then we use the packets to go much deeper and find out what the rest of the story is about that suspicious activity and actually get to the root cause and understanding what's happening. So I hope folks enjoy it.
All right, let's take a look at that.
This demonstration will focus on the Observer Platform's ability to detect and respond to threats that occur on your network. Let's start with detect. In this example, we see that we have a number of profile exceptions. A profile exception occurs when a device or service is acting out of character. This can be an indicator of compromise. Our profile exception is related to DNS traffic. Our service profile for DNS specifies the expected behavior of DNS requests, and here we've been alerted that there are DNS queries going out to a host that's not approved for corporate use. Let's look at the associated events. Here we can see how often this particular issue is occurring and how many of these exceptions are being observed. The event list will show us each individual profile exception. In this case, there is one source address that is not talking to our corporate DNS servers. Instead, it's talking to 8.8.8.8, the Google public DNS IP address. Drilling down on one of our events provides us with additional flow details associated with the event. Here I can see the MAC address, the number of packets, the number of bytes, and I can also see the user ID that was associated with this source IP address at the time this event was occurring. One more click lets me visualize the conversations that this user and this IP address were having. We note that it is only DNS traffic, which is a bit odd at best. So, using enriched flow data, we've gone from identifying the unexpected behavior to understanding the exact behavior details in 3 clicks. We detected the problem. Now we need to respond. What additional forensic details can we get if we incorporate packet data into the mix? I'm going to search for this one IP address and only the DNS traffic associated with it. Looking at our request codes in the upper left, we see the bursty nature of this behavior. First nothing, then a burst of nearly 300 requests, then nothing, then another burst. Shifting our gaze across from left to right, we see that many of the responses coming back from the Google DNS server are error codes. It doesn't know what to do with these requests. Now we've reached the point in our forensic investigation where we want and need the packets. We need to know what this device is transmitting because it clearly isn't just sending out properly formed DNS requests that just happen to be going to the wrong server. The request for the raw data, including the storage device, the time range, the IP address and protocol and port filters are already set for us. Once the trace is generated, we can just open it up in our favorite protocol analyzer. Here's what our capture looks like in VIAVI's Observer Analyzer application. Here's the interesting bit, this purported DNS query. If we look at the payload, we see this is clearly not a legitimate DNS query. Now we can be fairly certain that data is being exfiltrated, and it only stands to reason that somewhere that data is being intercepted and collected on its way to the Google server. Let's see what happens if we run this suspicious data through a base64 decode. Here's the rest of the story. Our next step would be to dump out all of the payload from these bogus DNS requests to provide documented proof of exactly what happened. From detection to response, the Observer platform combines the power of both enriched flow and packets to help you quickly identify and resolve issues. We started with using flow data to identify a profile exception, something acting or being utilized in a way that it shouldn't. From there, our response was packet-level validation and documentation of the issue. We know exactly what's been compromised.
Oh, Ward, that was great. Appreciate the demonstration. That was a really good video. Why don't we go ahead and start wrapping up? If you want to just kind of go over a little bit about what we were discussing and just kind of recap, that would be great.
Sure. You know, I'll highlight a few things, Jeff. If we go back to the beginning of our conversation, remember that act like you've been hacked mindset. The questions we want to be asking is, do I have the visibility I need to answer all the questions that are going to get asked when a breach occurs? And, you know, again, don't let it be a one-time exercise. Let it be something that you're constantly reevaluating as you're dealing with the constant change that we are all facing. Another thing I'll highlight is leverage both packet and flow data effectively for detection and response. I like to say your network has so much that it wants to tell you. All you have to do is listen. And so, you know, it's always good to kind of, again, reevaluate where are the data sources, what are the best data sources, am I listening to them as effectively as I can? Flow, especially enriched flow, is tremendously useful for detecting anomalous behaviors, but there's simply no substitute for packets when what you need is literally court admissible evidence that proves what happens and details and documents any damage that was done. As things change in the environment, make sure the cameras are pointed in the right directions. And lastly, again, you have the data. We don't need new data. We don't need more data, but make sure that your tools are doing the right things with that data through automated analysis, efficient workflows, intuitive visualizations, because we want to allow as many people as possible to solve as many problems as possible with that data.
Yeah, and again, going back to our time at Network General, the data, like you say, it's there. It's always been there. It's just now taking a different look at that same data and having it tell us a little bit more about, you know, just can we talk to one another as far as two computers? Instead, what's actually happening on our network? What are the adversaries doing, and how can we actually detect that with that data?
The bad guys will go to great lengths to cover their tracks. and they can do that in some areas pretty successfully, right? They can erase the logs. There's some things that they can do to sort of hide the fact that they've been there, but they can't take the packets off the wire. Those packets are big red footprints, and they show you every step that was taken. As long as you've got them, you've got the evidence that you need, and that's something that we never want to lose sight of. As things move around the environment, it's another thing to evaluate. Am I capturing the packets in all the right places?
Exactly. Well, Ward, I appreciate your time today. It's been great catching up with you. I'm so happy we're able to chat, and appreciate your insight into leveraging the VIAVI technology to help basically detect attacks and attack vectors. So thanks again for joining me, and make it a great day.
Thanks for the opportunity, Jeff, and appreciate all your listeners hanging in there with us.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for watching. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Check out our YouTube channel for previous Let's Talk Security broadcasts. Just go to youtube.com and search for Sinnott Wolach Technology Group. This episode is sponsored by VIAVI Solutions and produced by Events by Drew Productions. Let's Talk Security is brought to you by Sinnott Wolach Technology Group, a leading provider of next-generation network and information security solutions and services.